Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host, Greg Moffitt, and today I'd like to present the latest episode in my TV and movie review series, Hauntology Dystopia. As always, I've got two items for your consideration. In this case today, two British TV series. The first of them being Timeslip. You see the box set. And the Jensen code. Where are we over here? The Jensen code. Okay, so both of these series were ostensibly children's series. I say ostensibly, I mean they were aimed at children back in the day, in the early 70s. But as I've commented before in this series, what passed for children's TV then was incredibly advanced in terms of concepts and ideas and production, delivery, just the intellectual demands on the viewer, so far above what's considered children's, let's just say, young teenagers TV today, if there is even such a thing. So turning to Timeslip first of all. Okay, so this was broadcast in 1970 through into 1971. There are basically three series, which is three overarching stories divided into various episodic parts. Now, as you might guess from the title, the main theme here is time, the nature of time and phenomena relating thereof. Now, interestingly, again, giving a lot of credit to both the producers and the intended audience for Timeslip. The first episode begins with a prominent scientific journalist of the era talking about some concepts around time, some alternate thinking about time that will help the viewer consider and deal with what they're going to be presented with in terms of different possibilities, time scenarios, time bubble, as it's called in the introduction. And in the series itself, the time phenomenon that is stumbled upon by the protagonist is called the time barrier. And this allows travel not only in time, but also in space. So to different parts of the planet at different time periods, past and future. So a little bit like a condensed Doctor Who type scenario. Overarching themes here in terms of storyline are science and technology, the use and abuse, the misuse of science and technology in the modern era, as it was then, rapidly emerging throughout the 70s. Of course, it had begun prior to that, but the 70s was really a time of huge quantum leaps, if you pardon the pun, in the realms of science and technology, whether it be consumer products or industrial, commercial, military, you name it, the whole gamut. There's a strong concern, shall we say, expressed in these stories about these developments and where they might lead. And the time travel element of the story is used to project far into the future and imagine some of the potential outcomes, which were being warned about at the time in the early 70s. Series from the same time period called Doomwatch, I see strong echoes in that here. Doomwatch I reviewed in a previous episode. You can check that out if you're interested. So yeah, past and future scenarios explored in Timeslip. By far the most interesting to me are the future ones. Indeed, it's only really the first serial that explores travel into the past with the potential of altering the future. The future ones are more interesting because they play on these ideas, the threat of future developments in science and technology. Now, the first one is set, the protagonists, there's lots of repeating characters in this. The protagonists are a young girl and a young boy. This is the audience really that the program's aimed at. So there are key players in the story, but there's a number of other characters scientists and the children's parents and whatnot that reappear. And interestingly, they reappear in past and future scenarios, sometimes as past and future versions of themselves, other times as essentially the same character, but just almost in an alternate universe in a way, as if they hadn't lived a life path that they're currently on, but what if they'd done something different? The idea of being introduced there of parallel timelines, and that everything that's possible in time exists in potential in time. It's just a question of whether it's realized in time or not, realized in reality. So the first one finds our young heroes in Antarctica in 1990. Bear in mind, this went out in 71. So a long time in the future. And we find what a recurring theme we're finding here, a secret scientific research station where they are developing technologies centered around longevity, life extension for humans, and shock horror, no surprise to anybody, cloning. The longevity drug designed to extend human life, ideally indefinitely. The cloning as another avenue of exploration. The idea being that if the longevity thing doesn't work, well, you can clone yourself and effectively be reborn into, it's just another version of you and carry on. The old body that you're in dies and your consciousness is transferred into the clone. Doesn't quite work out like that. So the future oriented serials, which are serial 2 and 3, they interconnect with characters and themes. And the next scenario that the children find themselves in is once again in 1990, but a very different future. And we have what you can only call a sort of tropical technocracy. That is to say, Britain finds itself in the grip, because that's what it is, of a increasingly hot tropical climate, and with all the environmental changes and challenges that brings with it, and is ruled by a technocracy. And it emerges that this technocracy are aiming to manipulate the climate to make it the optimal world for humans. And this manipulation is ongoing, not just in Britain, but right across the world. It's a global effort, it has to be, in order to radically change the global ecosystem. And climate change is just a way of achieving that. It's alter the climate. It's weather control, climate control of the most extreme kind, not the sort that's supposedly brought about by the activity of the sun or by humans dumping pollutants into the environment and the atmosphere, but deliberately engineered. And really, what they're aiming at, the technocratic elites, who appear to be completely unhinged, if not insane, is to bring about the end of nature and the new age of man. There being the fatal conceit that we are somehow not part of nature. This plan is referred to very James Bond villain style as simply the master plan, and what it represents is a great reset of first the climate and then everything that follows from that, all life on Earth. The world as we see it in this hothouse future is a typical digital dystopia, surveillance technology, tracking, all that paranoid 1984 Brave New World stuff. And at its fringes, what you call the resistance. These are outsiders, people who are living in relatively primitive conditions, and the fringes, in fact, outside of the mega cities. So everything's concentrated in the mega cities. That's where all the tech is, and all the technocracy is, and all the technocrats. Beyond that, in the jungles that now cover most of Britain and other parts of the world, are these outsiders. Now, the beauty of this story as it unfolds, it turns out that nature itself has a role in pushing back against the technocratic manipulation. And it also turns out, interestingly, that the natural world as it still exists in this future digital dystopia is actually antithetical, is toxic to clones. They can't survive, whether it's the sunlight, any of the natural environmental conditions are toxic to them. it's psychological reconditioning is the plan for those who will not accept the technocracy, because it turns out that even if their scientific promises could be made to be manifest, that psychologically people still have a resistance to this shutting down of nature and making a planet, God knows how, somehow for humans only. And some of the interesting themes that come up in this, in terms of tension, yeah, there is the technocracy against the integration with the natural world that we're all part of, but there is a kind of cloak and dagger of who's real, quote unquote, who's human and who's clone. This becomes very murky at some points. This also occurs in the previous story set in the Antarctic. And the ultimate tensions that I would draw out, the ultimate themes I would draw out, which is so relevant to so many of the things I've covered previously in the series and to where we find ourselves in the world now, is the ongoing march of technocracy, writ large today in the form of the Great Reset, the World Economic Forum, the Davos crowd, all of that, and scientism, that is the religiosity, a new religion of science at the exclusion of everything else. And fundamentally, questions around the nature of time itself. They're some of the most interesting. So even when you take a step back from where all this finds itself in the real world and all the doom and gloom, all of the questions about what would happen to people if we could travel in time, if we could meet our future selves, past selves, if we met a future version of ourselves that had lived a different life, a life that we never thought possible, a life that we would be horrified by, all of those questions are addressed. And overall, it's a very thoughtful series, and one which I hadn't actually seen until very recently. So that was another archive item that I somehow missed in past rebroadcasts. So we'll jump on to our second item today. As mentioned at the top of the show, the Jensen Code. Okay, this series from 1973, as mentioned previously, once again aimed at children, but would be way over the heads of many of that demographic today, who are preoccupied in no small part with other trivialities. So one of the first things that came up in this story for me that was of interest is because once again you've got a secret military cum scientific research facility located near a cave system. And this reminded me of the significance of underground locations in other things that I reviewed at Penda's Fen. I did the great review of that with Thomas Sheridan and myself discussing that. You'll find that on the channel. And also Raven TV series, which I reviewed as part of my presentation at last year's Mysterious Earth conference, but I haven't got to it yet. I'm going to come back to that as part of Hauntology and Dystopia. The story revolves around the aforementioned research station, but in the vicinity, we see our protagonists who are at an outward bound center. Now, this is for young people and it's aimed at physical, mental, character, moral development, all sorts of good things, and often aimed at those that may have had a challenging background. So it's to challenge the challenged to be better and to self-improve mentally and physically. The characters we see in this story may have had troubled backgrounds, maybe young offenders, something like that. So we find them doing potholing and other activities in this outward bound center in these caves near the research facility. Trouble first arises, or not trouble, but the signposts towards trouble, when some of the characters begin to experience what can only be described as time slips, time anomalies, lost time. I was down there for 5 minutes. No, you weren't. You've been gone for 2 hours, that type of thing. And thereafter, it becomes a web of intrigue and agendas set around this Ministry of Defense Research Center, the people coming and going from that, the people coming and going from the Cave Network. At one point we hear, as part of a radio broadcast in the background, but again, clearly intended to be heard by us, the audience, is a news report about satellite, which should be shortly going into orbit. And for the first time, we hear there will be computers in space. Now, strictly speaking, in 1973, that wouldn't have been true if we consider the Apollo moon missions, and indeed other, just orbiters before the moon missions were even undertaken. And the Jensen in the title of the series is Dr. Jensen. And he's been in charge of this program to put this military surveillance satellite into orbit. And that will be able to track every moving object in Earth's atmosphere, lower, upper, low Earth orbit, all of it. This would mean military, could concentrate on military vehicles, missiles, other satellites, all of that activity tracked around one hub. And for that time, that would have been radical and revolutionary technology. And of course, we're in here now into the realms of espionage. There's kidnappings, there's mind control, there's hypnotism, there's amnesia, people trying to extract information. For example, who holds the Jensen code? Only Dr. Jensen holds it, but then he's kidnapped and eventually murdered. He's passed the code on to who? What is the code? Turns out our young protagonist, what part of the group at the Outward Bound Center, is the holder of the code. What's the nature of the code? What does it do? Why is it so valuable? Is there something beyond just the monitoring of this air and low Earth orbit traffic that this code and access to the satellite provides information on? So all in all, I thought this was a really fast-moving, intriguing little series. It keeps you guessing, and one of the main issues, and you see this in a lot of tales of espionage and intrigue, is trust. Who's working for who? Who can you trust? And there's kind of a Cold War vibe about it as well. There isn't like a Russian-American type polarity, but there's very much a them and us, or two sides. And you're definitely kept guessing as to who the good guys are. And indeed, the possibilities introduced, really, ultimately, are there any good guys in this? Why does it always have to be so black and white? I was reminded a little bit on the Press File, the classic spy thriller with Michael Caine from 1965. This is kind of like a teenage version of that in some ways. So yeah, the Jensen Code, thoroughly recommended, of its era, lots to like therein. So I've mentioned before, just before I round up, the issue of tapes being wiped, original master tapes of TV shows back in the era when tape was so valuable, that studios, production companies would record the shows, broadcast them once, maybe more than once, wipe the tapes, and then just move on, use them for something else. This famously resulted in the loss of many remarkable episodes of Doctor Who that will never be seen again, but many, many series and indeed movies, documentaries, all sorts of shows have fallen victim to this cultural vandalism, which I guess you could say is a product of just economic pressures at the time. But nonetheless, both these shows fell victim to this, which is why they predominantly exist in black and white copies only, even though they're both filmed in color. The black and white were from telescreenings done later and just recorded, almost like if you can imagine taking a video camera and filming your TV screen, something happening on there, and then having that as the only master copy. That's the sort of situation that you're looking at there. So just a reminder before we wrap up today, we've been looking at Timeslip, broadcast 1970, 71, and the Jensen Code from 1973. Now, you might have noticed that both these DVDs were issued by the company Network, who I mean, if you look at their catalog, as was, so many amazing editions of obscure, hard to find shows. And I'm posting on social media a lot and speaking to anybody who'll listen about the power and the value of owning physical media as we go into this increasingly virtual cloud-based age where nothing's really yours at all and it can be switched on and off at will by third parties. Network went into administration, so who knows what will happen to the rights that they might have owned, or maybe they only license these things. Who does own the rights? Maybe these DVDs will be the last ever the last ever physical versions of these shows made available. I'd like to think not, but it's entirely possible. And these weren't expensive, but things like this are becoming increasingly difficult to find and pricey to boot. So that's all for today. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffitt, and you've been watching LegalizeFreedom.com.
LegalizeFreedom.com